Is today, but obviously it's been out the last couple of days. I don't know how much you guys know, but we took a trip to Spirit Song in Kings Island the last couple of days. The first day, I know it registered 106 where we were at, and the heat index made it feel like 110, and that was very hot to be in an amusement park. But we had fun nevertheless, and the concerts were great. Last night we had a storm, which I know that you guys had that here as well, and many people lost power, and then we got back to our hotel room, and the power was gone in our hotel room, so we decided to drive back, and some of us drove back and still didn't have power, and still don't have power at this moment, so we need to be praying for that, and hopefully that gets back on soon, so for you guys. But we've been, I'm glad you guys are here. We've been in a series here. This is week number 5 in a 6-week series called Not a Fan. And I think most of you have been here for it. But what the premises is, it's based off a book by a minister by the name of Kyle Idleman. And he, in his workings and dealings with the church worldwide and just in his own life, he realized that in the church there's lots of people, even himself included, and I kind of found myself in this situation reading the book, that a lot of times we are fans of what Jesus did and who Jesus was versus being a follower of Jesus. And Jesus calls us to be a committed follower of Him, to follow Him in our lives. And he asked us to give up everything and to follow Him, to put Him first above all else in our lives. And oftentimes, a good percentage of people come to church on a regular basis, which, don't get me wrong, that's a great thing, and come to different activities and maybe serve and do other things, but they never fully commit their lives. And I think the reason is, and his idea in the book is, they don't understand what it means to be a follower, a true follower of Jesus Christ. And that's what we're kind of been learning about the last few weeks. This week, we're going to talk about a section of it called More Than Rules. That's the title of the message this evening. If you have a bulletin, there's an outline in there, and we'll be going through that. And we'll be in John chapter 8, the first 11 verses. John chapter 8, first 11 verses. And it'll be up on the screen, and it may be on the back of your outline as well. I think, I don't know if it is, yeah. So, John chapter 8, first 11 verses there. So let's go ahead and read that to start with. Probably familiar with this passage, but we'll read it again and just kind of dissect it a little bit. It says, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. And the law of Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and he wrote on the ground. At this time, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." Now, it reminds me of a church that I worked in before. I remember a girl that was in high school, and she was, I want to say, a sophomore or junior in high school, and she got pregnant. And she gave the talk of the church, literally while she was there, and there was lots of people that, did a lot of the whispering behind the back type thing, and I don't recall that she came with a family. This church was located in an inner city, in a neighborhood, so she seemed to be coming on her own, maybe with some other friends, I don't know. But she kept coming, and even though when she started to show a little more and those type of things, some parents obviously had a problem with this, or they felt like there was an issue with this. They didn't want their kids to see this teenager that was pregnant, and they thought it was a bad example for their teenagers that were these goody Christian kids. one Sunday, I remember sitting a few rows back in the sanctuary, and I heard these two moms in there, and at this time the girl was very pregnant, and she came walking in, and the two moms whispered, and I remember hearing them say something along the lines, "I cannot believe that she come in here in that kind of condition, or that looking like that, you know, with her pregnancy." And I don't remember ever seeing her come again after that Sunday. And it really saddened my heart. You know, but what brings the story to my mind is that I came across this girl's Facebook not too long ago, her Facebook page, and many of us are familiar with Facebook, but on a Facebook page you can go to an About section and read information about people, you know, and see things like, you know, where they live and what they're doing now, and things they like, movies, music, etc. Also favorite quotations. And here this is many years later, and I noticed this to be one of her favorite quotes. And this comes from Gandhi. It says, "I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." And that actually reminds me of the story we just read in John chapter 8 here. You know, Jesus is teaching in the courtyard, and his teaching's interrupted as these people come bursting in, this angry mob with this girl, and the story seems to indicate, or the context seems to indicate, she may have just been, because she seemed to be caught actually in the act of adultery. So she may have just been wrapped in a bed sheet or something as they bring her in, and they shove her into the dirt on the ground in front of Jesus, and one of the religious leaders gives the accusation, and he says to Jesus, he says, "We found this woman in bed with a man that was not her husband. The law says we should stone her. What do you say, Jesus?" And this was a pushy move by the religious leaders, trying to trap Jesus and trying to use the rules to pin him down. You know, rules can do that to us. They may not turn us into an angry mob or those type of people, but we may not form together and parade a center around town, but we may huddle in whispering circles and drop someone's name to everyone we talk to. Now please understand, God's Word does provide guidance and commandments for a reason. They're there to protect us. They're there to help us along the way in our walk and our relationship. And none of us follow those perfectly. Matter of fact, the Scripture says all fall short of the glory of God. All have fallen short. Some may be more public, some more private. But we have to be careful in overemphasizing the following of rules. If we do that, a lot of times if we overemphasize the following of rules, we give this persona or this look that maybe we've got everything all figured out. We've got it all together. And see, people don't want to share their struggles with you because then they think, you know, we're perfect. And that's kind of what I want to address this evening. That's what I want to look at this evening. You see, sometimes certain Christians can be a lot more like the Pharisees and religious leaders in the Bible than our Jesus. And we end up using the rules to rationalize how we treat others in the church, others in the community, our jobs, our schools, or wherever, especially newcomers or those whose sins are difficult to hide. Now, I think this happens oftentimes unintentionally. Don't get me wrong. And I think Christians like these mean well. They'll say, well, we're trying to keep the standard high around here. We want to make sure we maintain a certain level of excellence in this place. So they make it hard for people to come to God. Or, if you want to come to God, then you've got to follow all these rules, and we've established that we've established just to make sure that only the people who are really serious about following God actually get in. But in the end, these well-meaning believers end up creating a list of rules that wear out and frustrate new believers. So that brings me to kind of the main central point of this message. Rules without a relationship equals chaos. Rules in the context of relationship equals freedom. Rules without a relationship equals chaos. But rules in the context of relationship equals freedom. We're going to kind of look at that a little bit more. the first thing I want to look at is rules can be troublesome. Rules can be troublesome. You know, growing up and going to school, and many of us that are in school now or whatever, I know it's summer and we probably don't want to talk about school, but we have rules. And there's rules for a reason. And some schools are more strict than others, particularly some private schools, and especially if you narrow it down to like Christian schools or religious private schools. One that I looked up said something like this: boys over 13 have to be clean shaven every day, or they get sent home to shave. This one's not so bad. Girls couldn't wear skirts more than 2 inches above their knees. That's one that maybe should be applied about everywhere. There are all kinds of rules, and they're closely monitored in some of these places and followed. In some schools, there are rules that boys have to wear collared shirts, and girls have certain rules about their makeup and their jewelry and that kind of thing. I also saw some other things, but again, it's fine for schools. Families also have rules. And here's what happens to a lot of kids. They associate those rules with not with them going to school, but with being a Christian. They associate those type of rules with, that's what it means to be a Christ follower. Somehow many of them get the message that these are rules you've got to follow in order to be a Christian, to really follow Christ. And when they graduate from high school, many of them actually just walk away because they're tired of trying to follow the rules and failing. They're exhausted from trying to keep these rules at school and at home. And again, those rules are fine, but the problem is that somehow they get the idea that following those rules made them a Christian. Back to this woman in John 8. She's looking down. She's humiliated, guilty, ashamed, disgusted with herself. She's been caught breaking the rules. And this may be the day that breaking the rules may cost her everything. Jesus kneels and he writes in the dirt. What's he writing? We don't know. There's lots of speculation. Scholars have guessed and tried to think, but we don't know what he wrote. But he seems to kneel down and just starts writing, and the accusers wait for an answer. They wait to try to find out what's going on. They know they've surprised him. They know that they've caught him off guard. They wait for him to submit to the letter of the law. Finally, Jesus looks up at these spiritual leaders, and he says words that we're very familiar with. If any of you is without sin, then he cast the first stone. And one by one, these bullies start dropping their stones, and I think they know that Jesus knows, and they walk away, and Jesus is left alone with just the woman. And perhaps with a little bit of a smile. He looks at her and he says, "Is there anyone left to condemn you?" And maybe she thought, you know, there is at least one person left that could condemn me. One person left. But with the tenderness that only Jesus can have, he looks at her and says, "Neither do I condemn you. You go now and leave your life of sin." Oh, the weight, the guilt is released. Grace, forgiveness. Rules sometimes can be troublesome. A second thing I want to look at this evening is the rules don't always inspire grace. The rules don't inspire grace. Now, my senior year in high school, I'll never forget this. It made somewhat of an impression on me, but as my chemistry teacher, I hated chemistry, did not care about it, did not want to take it. It was not my favorite class, but I had to take it. And but my teacher was a Christian. And he apparently wanted to show us an example of God's grace. So we had this big test coming up, and we had to pass this test in order to pass the class. He had been stressing for weeks. He had been giving us stuff to study on. And me being the procrastinator that I am sometimes, I waited to the last minute trying to study and sat down the night before looking over all this stuff and said, "I am not going to learn this tonight." And so I had resolved in my mind that things are not going to go well on this test. And then we get in there and he passed out all these tests, and he says, "Now be careful and make sure you read all the instructions." I said, "Okay." So I read, and I looked through all the questions, and quickly I started to realize that this test I was going to fail. I didn't know the stuff on this test. But then I got to the very last page, and I saw these words. It said, you can try and get an A by taking the test, or you can just put your name on it and turn it in and get an A. And I quickly put my name on it, got up, turned it in, and walked out of the class. I found out later, though, that one of the boys, his name was Patrick, he didn't quite fare so well because he didn't read all the instructions, you see. So he just continued to work on it. He tried to pass the class, and he didn't even look at the end. He just did some of the answers, didn't get the test done in the time that he had, turned it in, never looked at the last of it, and he failed. And then there was Michaela. Michaela, she actually saw the end, but she thought, I studied for like 8 weeks for this test. And, she had spent so much time studying. She thought to herself, I am not going to, succumb to this teacher who gives an A for nothing. I understand that she actually stayed and took the test all the way through. And her mind, the way she thought about it was that if she was going to get an A, she was going to earn that A. A fan says this, I'm not taking any handouts. I can do this on my own. And so fans spend their lives carrying around the burden of religion. And the grace of Jesus, that same grace that saved a woman from being stoned, calls to those who have been hauling around a long list of rules, a long list of rituals and obligations. And Jesus calls to those who are tired of pretending to be more than they are. And he calls to those who have had the guilt and fear of religions, wear them down. And he says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Maybe you grew up in a home where you were taught about Jesus. Maybe you went to church on the weekend and church camp in the summer, and you learned to fear Jesus. So you kept as many rules as you could, hoping that you wouldn't go to hell. And when you would sin, you feel guilt, wondering if you would be good enough to make it. And you were taught to observe different religious traditions and rule keeping. But somehow you never really fell in love with Jesus. You became a fan. Because when we come into a situation in which rules take precedence over love and grace, it's hard to actually fall in love. Think about it this way. When I got married to my wife, there were some rules that I said I would live by. Some of them were written and some were unwritten. But I understand when I said I do, that I would be faithful to her as long as we both live and I'm going to be hers alone. To provide for her, I'm going to meet her needs. To be committed to her for better or for worse. All right? There are other rules I didn't know about that have since been established. I am to take out the trash when it's full. I am to not try to understand anything she says until 30 minutes after the alarm goes off. And I am to bathe at least twice a week. I bathe more than that, I promise. If I saw a relationship as a bunch of rules I had to keep, I wouldn't be very happy, would I? But because I love my wife, I find joy in being a good husband. I find joy. I would do anything for her. And so doing the dishes or putting the lid down on the toilet or other extravagant acts of sacrifice or joy at the time or whatever, most of the time, in the end, the grace and the love of God frees us and inspires us to live for Him. Augustine said this, who can be good if not made so by loving? Love God and do as you please. He could say that because he knew that when you love God, you will want to please God. But your priority has to be, your emphasis has to be, your focus has to be on first loving God. It has to be about a relationship with Jesus, otherwise it won't work. The third thing I want to look at this evening is this. The rules don't keep us around. The rules don't keep us around. I want to say this very carefully and clearly. When our kids grow up and they define Christianity as keeping a moral code, or they define Christianity as being a follower of Jesus Christ, if they define Christianity as being a moral code instead of defining Christianity as being a follower of Christ, then they will walk away from both. We think, well, I've got to make sure they understand the rules. They understand they have to do these things. This is against the rules. They have to do this. These are the obligations of being a Christian. And while that is true, I'm telling you, if they define Christianity that way, instead of defining Christianity as following Jesus, they will walk away from both. They will walk away from Jesus and the moral code. We must define Christianity first and foremost as the following of Jesus Christ. We cannot expect to recruit the world to a set of standards that we would never live by or follow if it wasn't for a love relationship that we have with Jesus Christ. They're not going to get on board with that unless it's because they know Jesus. So it must be first and foremost about following Jesus. Another church that I worked in, I had a volunteer. This was an incredible story. I had a volunteer that just was keen to different situations, and a lady had walked in and she knew that she was new there for some reason or another, and she couldn't get her to where she knew she was struggling trying to figure out where to go. She looked uncomfortable, all those things, and she walked up to her and said, "Can I help you get to where you're going?" And she said, "Well, I need to get my son. Is there a place where my son goes?" And so she helped her with that, and on the way there she explained to this volunteer that she hadn't been to church in 6 years, and that she had went through a terrible divorce, and that the church that she was going to no longer welcomed her to church. Told her that she was not allowed to come back there because of her marital situation. And the volunteer had explained to her that she had also been through a divorce, and there obviously was some common ground there, and asked her and said, "You know, if it'd be all right with you, I'd like to sit with you during service." And so they did, and I guess she actually asked the question, "Am I allowed to go into the sanctuary since I'm not a member?" It actually absolutely astounds me, some of the rules that we put on people as the church. I'm not saying Central, but I'm just saying as the church. And volunteer went on to explain the situation. As the first song started to play, this girl just started to sob. Probably feelings of lots of things that were going on inside of her. Through the service, she went from tense and nervous to some of the things that were said, to how comfortable she felt, to becoming calm and excited. And at the end, service was over, and the volunteer asked her, she said, "Do you need to leave? Can I help you with anything as you leave?" Assuming she needed to go pick her son up. And she said, "Do I need to go talk to him if I want to join the church?" And she said, "Well, yeah, it would be the person that you talk to." She goes, "Well, I want to join the church today." So I've never felt more loved. And so she walked down the aisle with her. She leaned forward and she whispered in my ear when she walked out. I was preaching that day. "I went through a divorce a few years ago, and the other church wouldn't have me. I was really more of a question than a statement, and I said, 'I'm sorry, but we would love to have you.'" And that's what I want to offer this evening. We would. We would love to have anybody. I don't know what your story is. I don't know if there is a Christian who bullied you or misrepresented you or misrepresented Jesus to you, or who wasn't at all like Christ. I don't know if it was a church that maybe taught a lot of traditions. There's lots of things out there. But you never really got around to studying the gospel of Jesus Christ or the scriptures. I'm not sure what the situation is. I don't know if maybe you grew up in some kind of religious affiliation where nobody seemed to make that big a deal out of grace, but sure made you feel really guilty every weekend. I've been there and been to those type of churches to where you feel like you have to come forward every week and give your life to Christ again and again and again and again. Come to the altar. We would love to have you come and experience the freedom that is found in knowing and following Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Again, rules without a relationship equals chaos. But rules in the context of a relationship with Jesus Christ equals freedom. Be free today. We offer that invitation. As we do every week, we offer a time that you can come forward, you can make a decision. I remember in my life times where it was all about following the rules or doing the right things. And again, I'm not saying that those are necessarily bad. What I'm saying is those things come as a result of your relationship with God, not before your relationship with God. It will never work if you're trying to do it first. it will fail. And we have to make sure when we're talking to others about Jesus, when we're talking to our kids about Jesus, that we're teaching them to follow Jesus first and then worry about the other stuff. Wherever you are this evening in your relationship with Him, if it's the first time, if it's I need to give my life to Him, I want to be a follower. Maybe you feel like tonight you have never really followed Him. It's all been about rule keeping. Make a decision to say, I want to follow Him today. Or maybe it's a recommitment. Or maybe it's I just need prayer, I need help. Whatever it is, as we sing our invitation song, we invite you to come forward as we stand and sing.